Hello and welcome to this webinar focusing on the new OECD report, Immigrant Students at School, Easing the Journey Towards Integration. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, is here with us to present the main findings from this report, which was published today. He'll also be available to answer your questions. You're welcome to send your questions to Eric Magnuson through the chat function on your screen at any time during or after the presentation. Andreas?
Thank you, Marilyn. It's a great pleasure to share this new report with you, which looks at the effectiveness with which education systems integrate students into their journey in school. And as a context, I wanted to highlight that what we know about the influence of social background on learning outcomes. And one of the most powerful findings that our PISA test has revealed is that poverty needn't be destiny. Look at the chart in front of you. You can see the students ordered in their performance by the decile of social background. So the red dot here are the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in Mexico who perform much worse than the students represented by the green dot. That's the 10% of students from the wealthiest family backgrounds. But if you compare that with Chile, you can see that if you're a poor child in Chile, you actually do worse than if you're a child from a similarly poor background in Mexico. And if you come from a wealthy background, you do better. And this highlights that children from similar socioeconomic backgrounds can perform quite differently on where they go to school. And you can see when you do this across countries how much that varies. That performance gap, that achievement gap between wealthy and less wealthy children actually varies across countries. The most impressive result is this. If you look at the 10% of the most disadvantaged children from Shanghai, and they typically come from very, very poor families and backgrounds. Often child with a migrant background, internal migrant, who come from sort of really disadvantaged families. And their results on the PISA test in mathematics was better than the results of children in some of the most privileged families around the world. I think that shows us that poverty isn't destiny. It should give us a lot of hope that we can actually do well with children even from the most adverse circumstances. And that's really the spirit of this report. It provides a lot of really good examples of how effective some countries have dealt with immigrant background. Let's have a look at this. The question really is whether our schools are prepared to help immigrant students not only immigrate, but integrate into their new communities, academically and socially. On this chart, you see sort of an illustration of the magnitude of the challenge. On the horizontal axis, you see the percentage of 15-year-old immigrant students in each country. And on the vertical axis, you see the performance of students on average across countries, here in reading. And you can see that countries like Canada, New Zealand, United States, Australia, they are countries with a long history of immigration. They have plenty of students with an immigrant background, but they also do still really well. In part, it's because often they have immigration policies that are quite selective. There are many factors playing into this, but overall, you can see that actually some of the countries with a large share of immigrant students do really well on this international test. And some other countries with very small shares of immigrants are not doing so well. One of the most interesting findings that we had is that actually between 2003 and 2012, most countries saw a significant share in the rise of students with an immigrant background. But in fact, we couldn't detect any negative impact on learning outcomes overall. That is, the rise in immigrant shares across the world has not led to a decline in performance, which some people would suggest, because often those people come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. In fact, one of the things that we saw is that immigrants often have even higher educational and occupational aspirations than their counterparts in the country, particularly if they come from the first generation. And have a look at the results in terms of performance. I'm showing you on this chart the share of disadvantaged students who are top performers, who basically reach the performance levels among the best performing students in the OECD countries. And you can say, see, this is the share among immigrants, and the yellow dot or white dot is the share among non-immigrant students without an immigrant background. And you can see actually, yes, there are countries where among non-immigrants there's a higher share of top-performing students, but again, in some countries it's the other way around, and in many countries those performances are quite similarly. In other words, the share of top-performing students in many countries is as high among immigrants as among non-immigrants. Of course, you know, the complete picture is it's also true at the other end of the spectrum. You have actually a large share of immigrant students with very low performance levels. That's while on average, often immigrants do not perform as well. But let's not forget, when we look at the best performing students, you find immigrants often as well represented as non-immigrant students. The same is true basically when you look at the parents of immigrants. Here on the chart you see the percentage of first-generation immigrant students who have at least one parent that is as educated as the average parent of those non-immigrant students in the country where they migrate to. So you can basically see in Canada that's true for 80% of the immigrant children, but even in Greece and Mexico, United States, we still talk about 30 to 40%. So once again, you know, immigrants are not always coming from with parents who have lower levels of education than the country of destination, but often actually also the parents bring with them a rich set of human talent and capital. One of the things that we've seen very quickly is that there is remarkable cross-country variation in the performance between immigrant students and students without an immigrant background. And that remains even true when you take into account the social and economic background of children. Because that's of course important. When you see performance variation, it could be a reflection of poverty, or it could be a reflection of immigration. But even if you take into account the poverty aspect, you see significant variation across countries. You can see that well on this chart. The blue bar shows you the performance in mathematics of immigrants in the first generation. Basically, this is the generation, the children who have moved themselves into the country of destination. The white triangle is the performance of students in the second generation. Basically, the parents have moved into the country, but they themselves were already born in their country of destination. And what you can see that in many countries, even the second generation performs significantly below the first generation, below the non-immigrant students without an immigrant background. In other words, if you're an immigrant and you are born in the country of destination and you've gone to kindergarten and school like everybody else, still have a performance disadvantage. And that is not explained by socioeconomic background. That remains even after accounting for this. But also, when you look at this chart closely, you can see in some countries that gap is very small, in others it's very large. In some countries also the gap between the second generation immigrants and those who have no immigrant background is very small. That is, if children just had the chance to go to the school system of the country of destination, then at least they perform as well as those. Big differences across countries. Now, one of the things that we found also very, very interesting is that the culture and the education that students acquire before migrating have an impact on student performance. Now, where you come from will influence your result in the country of destination. But interestingly, the country where students settle actually matters even more. Let's have a look at some interesting data on this. Here I show you the performance of students from Turkey who migrated to countries like the Netherlands, to Denmark, to Germany, to Switzerland, Belgium, and Austria. This is the first generation of immigrants. They just came into the country, and this is how they come out. And actually, you know, all those people coming from Turkey, all those 15-year-olds, perform quite similarly across countries. Around 470 points on the PISA scale, roughly 500 is the average. They all do not do as well as the average performer, but they don't do very differently across countries. Now, how do they do when they are in the second generation, those students from Turkey? Basically, when they have already been born in the country of destination. And this is where the results become very interesting. Here you can see much greater variation. So in the first generation, they just came into the country of destination. They performed quite similarly. In the second generation, in many countries, they do a lot worse, actually, but not in all countries. Compare Germany and Switzerland, for example. The first generation, very similar performance, but in the second generation, those who have gone for their complete schooling career to school in the country of destination, in Switzerland, those Turkish students, or students with a Turkish background, do significantly better than they do in Germany. So that shows you actually that the country of destination can make a real difference in integrating students. Let's have a look. Denmark is another example where you can basically say the first generation does really well, but the second generation of Turkish students does a lot less well in Denmark. Let's have a look at students from Arab-speaking countries. Very similar picture. You can see in the Netherlands, those students do quite well. In the UAE, they do so-so. In Denmark, they do less well. In Finland, they do less well. And in Qatar, they do a lot worse. These are basically students from Arab-speaking countries who migrated to those countries. If you take students from China, it's amazing. No? They do well everywhere. Wherever they go, they come up with very, very strong performance results. And very little, remarkably, very little difference in their performance. They move to the country of destination and are doing well in school. But I want to bring in another dimension, and that's basically looking now not at academic integration, but at social integration. Here I measured the percentage of students who have an immigrant background who reported that they feel they belong to school. So where school has succeeded to make school a place where they feel well, where they feel integrated, where they make friends, all of those kinds of things. And what's interesting is that academic integration and social integration don't always go along with each other. If you look at Finland, for example, Finland does just so-so when it comes to academic integration of students from Arab-speaking countries. But Finland does really well when it comes to social integration. And both of those dimensions matter. Both of them are important. Denmark does so-so when it comes to academic integration, but does quite poorly when it comes to social integration. So we can actually now look at the effectiveness of the country of destination for integrating students with a similar social background, a similar country of origin or language of origin, and how differently they came out depending on where those students go to school. We found those results really intriguing, really amazing. They tell us a lot about the quality of the learning organization and environment in the country of destination. When you look at sense of belonging more generally across countries, you can find also there big variation across countries. When you look to Spain, to Israel, to Kazakhstan, to Norway, to Serbia, to Greece, and so on, students typically, they may not be well academically integrated, but they feel socially integrated. When you look to France, Montenegro, and Belgium, their levels of social integration seem to be very, very low, even among students who may be academically integrated. So it's worth having a look at both of those dimensions. Now, one of the questions that we have asked ourselves is, it's probably not all a matter of schools. What about the attitudes and values of the citizens in the host country? So we've asked a couple of questions. We looked at basically at individual reports on whether the country, your country, is made a worse place or a better place to live in by having immigrants. And the results were quite remarkably different. And these are data from 2012. You can see, for example, in Iceland, in Sweden, and Denmark, the Nordic countries, you can see there's a large share of the population who thinks or says that actually their own country is made a better place by immigrants. Now, if you go to the Russian Federation, to Portugal, to the Soviet Republic, and so on, you see that actually the share of people who think it's a better place is smaller. A larger share of people think actually things are getting worse through immigrants. So the attitudes of societies are quite different on this. Should countries allow many, or should they allow few immigrants from poorer countries outside of Europe to get into Europe? We asked that to European citizens, and you can see again, if you go to Sweden, if you go to Germany, if you go to Norway, to some extent Poland, you can actually see that the share of people who are willing to let more people in from poorer countries is quite large. But actually, if you go to Hungary, to Israel, to the Czech Republic, there you feel that actually the country is rather closed. They would prefer to allow fewer people from poorer countries outside Europe into their country. And we can see that these are also things that change. In some countries, the gap between 2000 and 2012 has become quite important. So again, there is variation in those measures. So the attitudes of citizens matters as well. Now, we have produced a little bit more nuanced results here. You know, allowing immigrant is not immigrant. People might be more open to allow people who are more like themselves than to allow people who are from a different group than the majority. And that's exactly what we could see. The lighter bar is basically allowing people from the same group than yourself, and the darker bar is allowing people who are different from you. And you look, for example, at the right hand of the spectrum, you can see in Israel, actually, the country is quite open to allow people who are similar to them, but actually quite sort of reserved to allow people into the country who are different from them. So dealing with diversity seems to be a major challenge in the case of Israel. If you look to Sweden, on the other hand, the country seems to be, or Norway, to some extent Germany, you can see actually that those countries seem to be rather open to allowing immigrants from both similar or different groups into their country. And once again, you can see actually how that has changed since 2000. So we need to take those attitudes into account. We also need to take into account that there are social and economic factors. For example, what seems to be the case is that actually the attitudes towards migrants seem to be better in countries where the state of the economy is better. You can also see that the perception of the state of the education system, where we ask people of their opinion, you know, is the education system good? Then you can see also that is related to the contribution they see migrants make to cultural life. So, you know, there are many, many factors which are related and shaping those kinds of attitudes towards migration. But it's an important contextual factor that obviously shapes the way in which students grow up in school, the attitudes of the other children to them, the attitudes of their teachers, and many of those factors. So we need to take that into account. We also need to take into account that disadvantage often comes in combination. You know, migrant students may have a tough time behind them, you know, flight refugees in particularly, and they often sort of have the double disadvantage that they also come from more disadvantaged, poorer backgrounds. And in fact, that's what we have tried to find out with these data. We looked at basically the difference in mathematics performance between immigrant students and those without an immigrant background, and you can see that here. In most countries, basically, there is a difference, there's a gap. Now, basically, students without an immigrant background do better than students with an immigrant background. And the blue bar here is showing you after controlling for social background. So this is the performance gap that you would see between immigrants and non-immigrants who are of the same kind of social background. If you just look at this at face value, you can see the gap is typically much larger, and in some countries more than twice as big. In other words, you see that the penalty that students have through their social disadvantage can be as big or bigger than the disadvantage of students with an immigrant background. And that's, of course, you know, that's ending up at the doorsteps of schools. Schools are then confronted not only with students who have this immigration challenge, where teachers need to invest in language education and so on, but they also have the challenge of disadvantage. Not all students, but a significant share of that. We also looked at to what extent, you know, do students go to school where there are already many students with an immigrant background. Here you can see the percentage of immigrant students in schools where at least half of the students are immigrants. And you can see that is quite significant. In the UAE, for example, in Qatar, in those countries, in Greece, Canada, Italy, there's a high degree of concentration of immigrants in individual schools, which obviously magnifies the challenge that schools face through immigration. But there's another part of the picture, and that's what you can see in this chart. To what extent does the concentration of disadvantage actually impact student performance? And here you can see basically that where basically there's a high concentration of immigration, it can have a very significant negative impact on learning outcomes. So it's not just, that students are there with an immigrant background, that they have a disadvantage, but the disadvantage is amplified by the share of other students who also have a disadvantage. And that's also one of the reasons at the end of my presentation I will highlight how important it is that basically we don't concentrate immigration to an extent that the problem becomes too hard to resolve for individual schools, but we ensure that it becomes attractive for schools actually to compete for immigrant students and to ensure that all students face a diverse student population. Language is an important factor. Here you see the percentage of immigrant students who do not speak the language of the assessment at home in the first generation. In the second generation, typically that percentage is much smaller in the second generation because, as students grow up in the country of destination, they have actually grown up in an environment of the language. Their parents will have learned the language, and that's, in the countries like the UK or Ireland, it's a large share of students. But in other countries, the gap remains. Students in the second generation still grow up with parents speaking their original language. And that obviously is a challenge for education systems. They have to invest more in the language education of children. And that's basically a measure how well they actually meet that challenge. Here we show the percentage of students who do not speak the language of assessment at home and who participate in at least 2 hours of training per week to improve their skills in the language of assessment. And we show that, depending on when they came into the country. You can see, for example, Singapore. There's a huge investment in language training for students within immigrant students, for basically all groups. But if you look to Slovenia, to Serbia, to Germany, even to Finland, Portugal, and so on, we can see actually this is just about 10–15% of students where that high level of investment is made. And our finding is it is actually about 2 hours of training per week that you need to actually integrate students linguistically into the country of destination. So there's a lot more that we could be doing from those kinds of language training. We also see that, for example, students with an immigrant background often have a much higher prevalence to be tracked into vocational schools, and that holds even, after accounting for student socioeconomic status. So even after accounting for performance. That means basically often immigrant students end up in schooling tracks that have lower performance expectations, even if they themselves may have a high level of academic potential. Suggests that we should watch those kinds of devices much, much more carefully. Last point I want to make is really about the importance of early integration. Here you can see basically that the reading performance of immigrant students was much higher in the child had attended pre-primary education for a sustained period than when they had not. In virtually all countries, the red dot that shows the performance of immigrant students who did not go to pre-primary schooling is a lot lower than those who had actually gone to pre-primary education. So there's a significant performance gap, not in all countries, but in many countries. So it suggests that actually, particularly for students with an immigrant background, early learning is of particular importance. Now, if that is so, we should hope that students from an immigrant background will all go to early childhood education and care. But in fact, as you can see from this chart, immigrant students in most countries are a lot less likely to have attended pre-primary education than immigrant students, than non-immigrant students. So I think that is something we need to take to heart. Those students who need early education most often get the least out of it. Now, pre-primary education, even where participation rates are overall quite high. Now, some countries have participation rates of 70, 80% of 2 to 3-year-olds, but still, the group that needs that support most, the socially disadvantaged or the immigrants, actually get the least out of it. Can we make a difference to this? Of course, that's a question we always ask ourselves. To what extent are those kinds of challenges amenable to public policy? The encouraging news is that actually in many countries, a lot has been done. When you look at first-generation immigrants, in most countries, the performance disadvantage of first-generation immigrants, marked here by the yellow diamond, was much bigger than it was among the non-immigrant students. Interesting question is more how it looks in the second generation, but even here you can see that in most countries actually progress has been made. In 2012, the gap in the second generation had narrowed. You can look to a country like Germany, very impressive. The gap was almost cut to half. So those children who had the chance to go through the whole education system in Germany did a lot better in 2012 than they did in 2003. In fact, when we look at this in more detail, much of the performance gain that we have seen in Germany between 2003 and 2012 in a field like mathematics is actually attributable to basically students with an immigrant background and disadvantaged students. It suggests that actually change is possible in this field. Many teachers are looking for help. Here you can see the percentage of lower secondary teachers who indicate that they have a high level of need for professional development in the area of teaching in a multicultural or multilingual setting. So dealing with diversity, you can see in Brazil, in Mexico, in Italy, that's a large share of teachers who basically say that that's something where they need to become better. In other countries, it seems to be better established, but this is from our Thales survey suggesting that it's something. And we also asked school principals, and you can see that in some countries there's a high share of principals, in the order of 20%, that basically say that ethnic diversity in their school hinders learning. And you can see that it's particularly true in principals from disadvantaged schools, marked here by the red triangle. So actually, it's a formidable challenge for schools in many countries, and particularly for school principals in disadvantaged schools. So let me conclude. What are possible policy responses? Well, let me try to order those policy responses by their expected impact on learning outcomes. But we always need to take into account the political and economic cost of change. Everybody wants to do things that are very important and easy to do. Nobody wants to put resources into things that are maybe not so important and very costly. But there are always things that are really important and difficult to do. And you can pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that may not be so important, but that are easy to do. So let me put those things on a map here, and then lead you step by step through this. The first thing that we found is that students are better in acquiring a new language when they are immersed in that language from the very beginning, rather than being separated put into separate language classes when they get into school. So sort of basically integrating students into regular classrooms while providing additional support in the language of destination. That seems to be the most effective recipe for effective integration. That may not always be feasible. For example, if you look at the current refugee crisis in Europe, these numbers are very large, and it's very hard to sort of integrate all of those students effectively. But a lesson that we learned from the past is that putting refugees, immigrants into separate classes is not going to be a good idea for them in the long run for language integration. Early education and childcare. If children enter such programs at the age of 2 or 3, they have a fair chance of starting school at the same level as non-immigrant children. And that's quite amazing, because our research also shows if you basically learn a language, it's easy, in school, it's easy to pick up the language that you need to communicate. But the level of academic language that is used in schools typically it takes 5, 6, 7 years to basically acquire wealth. So getting that right at the beginning in early childhood education and care is a great way to actually put children on a level playing field. We've also seen that targeted home visits can be important, basically moving towards those families either directly or having intermediaries. Some countries have some really interesting examples where immigrants themselves support the connection between schools and families and other families. So it's a very important part to basically get to the families. Many classrooms struggle with the immigration challenges, and we see, as you could see from the numbers, that teachers really, really struggle. They feel ill-prepared in pedagogical approaches and also ill-prepared in the kind of second language learning that is so important for those immigrants. And those are things where building capacity is essential. And the scale of immigration now is such that you can no longer leave that just to a specialized teacher in the school, but it really needs to be built into every teacher's repertoire, dealing with diversity, integrating students with an immigrant background, integrating the culture of immigrants. The many countries are clearly have a clear goal of integrating students into the language of instruction, but in the material, in the instructional material, they try to reflect the cultural diversity of the student intake. Some countries also try to reflect the cultural diversity of the student intake in the teaching population. So there's a lot of effort basically in building capacity that builds the system best. One thing is clear, is that schools that struggle to do well for domestic students, students with a large disadvantaged population, are going to face an even larger challenge when they deal with a large population of immigrants. So countries that distribute migrant students across a mix of schools tend to achieve better outcomes for those students. A more even distribution also gets away some of the pressure on schools and teachers when large numbers of immigrant students arrive in a short period of time. So avoiding congregation, very, very important. Parents, once again, teachers are obviously critical to the success of migrant students, but so are the parents of those students. Students do better when their parents understand the importance of schooling, so communicating the value of schooling, how the school system works, helping parents to navigate what are often very complex education systems with multiple tracks and streams where you actually have to make important choices that have consequences. Those things all pay off. And last but not least, ability grouping, grade repetition, tracking, all tend to reinforce social background, but also the impact which immigration has on learning outcomes. All in all, I think what these data really show is that there is a lot that education systems can do. Some countries seem to be very, very effective in integrating large shares of students with an immigrant background. And we have seen very positive development over time, at least in some countries, where countries have become better in integrating a more diverse student population into their schooling system. Academic integration is not everything. We've seen that social integration can vary as much as academic integration, and that sometimes academic and social integration don't go in the same direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We received a few questions during your presentation, so let me begin by first asking you whether the infrastructure of EU countries are ready to provide education and training to immigrants, or should we point to e-learning solutions, particularly for adults?
I think that's a very good question. When we talk about adults, that's certainly a very promising solution, helping immigrants navigate the education system, providing access to learning resources, providing access to the labor market, labor market orientation. All of those things are ones where e-learning could be a very, very powerful tool. When it comes to schooling, our evidence actually is that e-learning so far hasn't delivered on its promise, its scale, at least not for the students without an immigrant. So I would hesitate to recommend it for new student populations. I think there's a lot of further research that we need still to do to make e-learning work for schools before we can rely on it as a tool for immigrant populations.
Thank you. Another participant asked, what needs to be done? The schools that already have high shares of immigrant students are not overstretched for integrating them. In other words, how can we practically change the mix of students? And a follow-up from that question is that in some countries, we know that parents are reluctant to send their children to schools with higher percentages of immigrant students. How can we facilitate change in that?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, what our data suggests actually, when the disadvantage in immigration are concentrated above a certain limit, all of those things become really tough for parents, for teachers, for students. So the challenge is really to, through public policy, but also through incentives, to actually ensure that it's attractive for every school to basically invite and address the needs of immigrant students and not to leave it to a few schools. Now, when you are in a situation, how you can change that, again, it is a matter of ensuring that those schools have access to adequate support. And this isn't just about, more support, more teachers. It's primarily about better support. It's easy to attract more teachers to a school with disadvantage or with a higher share of immigrants. What is a lot harder is to attract the most talented teachers into those classrooms where they're most needed, where they can make most of a difference, where teachers have the kind of training, the repertoire of pedagogic practices that adequately deals with diversity, that they can make a difference. That's the fundamental challenge. But again, there are very, very good examples for this as well, where actually school turnarounds have been successful in such schools. But I think the warning sign is this is really difficult. There are not many examples of successes overall. Over concentration of disadvantage in immigration poses often unsurmountable problems for schools.
Thank you. Another question we have, what could be the possible reasons for the improvement in Germany between 2003 and 2012 in terms of the performance gap between immigrant and non-immigrant students?
Yeah, in the year 2000, actually, the large performance disadvantage of immigrant students was a big puzzle for educators and was a big embarrassment for the country, because the country thought, we are paying every teacher the same, we invest a lot in education, we treat immigrants in the same way as non-immigrants, so why do we have this massive performance gap? And I think this has sparked a lot of important initiatives. One of it was, for example, early language diagnosis. Sometimes those students were just sitting in classroom, no one knew what their language difficulties was. Dealing with those students blindly is often the bigger part of the problem. So there was a lot of effort actually invested in finding out what their learning needs are, providing schools with extra support, extra resources, doing testing so that there was basically good evidence available on where additional language training was needed, and systematic investment in this. But I think the recognition in the year 2000, when the first PISA results came out, it was the first time that the country had access to comparative data, sparked a host of initiatives, creating greater awareness for diversity. All of those things were done in a very short time, and it shows actually, once we see and tackle those problems, we can address them.
Another question from a participant, what data supports the conclusion that language immersion is the best way to integrate students and not to start students in classrooms where they continue to learn in their native language?
Yeah, actually, we have looked at a whole range of examples, and our report actually highlights them. Basically, the language of destination is the fundamental instrument for students to have access to the rest of the curriculum. Where students struggle in that language, they're going to have a disadvantage in mathematics and science and history anywhere else. So basically ensuring that those students right away have the tools to give them access to the curriculum is of fundamental importance. Where those tools are missing, students have a huge performance disadvantage. You can see this from the PISA results, where students have insufficient language. They often also tend to perform poorly in mathematics, poorly in science, in other areas. So this is something we should never underestimate. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't also ensure that students can speak the language of the country of origin. A lot of countries actually provide some resources, some support for that. But the fundamental key for success is that they speak the language of destination. which is the tool through which they have access to the rest of the curriculum.
In a related question, did the OECD examine the impact of support to the home or heritage language of pupils in terms of their learning outcomes?
We have an indicator on the support of language in the destination language, in the language of instruction and learning outcomes. We have not been able to look at the heritage language or culture because that is a too diverse picture. It would be hard to sort of quantify this in any international comparative way. But there is other research that has actually studied those kinds of questions, and some of that actually we have a couple of text boxes on this in our report.
We have a question from someone from Italy who asks, what is your point of view about the high level of immigrants here and the school's problems to integrate them? Is it only a question of funding and teacher performance?
Yeah, I think one must say, the data that I showed you here are from before this latest huge influx of immigration. I think what we have now is not only we have a structural problem, but it is also compounded with a flow problem. In Italy, obviously, many schools are overwhelmed. But even before the immigrant crisis, the current massive rise in inflow, the data that you just saw show that Italy also, before that time, had a massive, more structural bound issue with the demand among teachers for better preparation for multicultural, multilingual environments. So Italian teachers didn't feel that they were sufficiently prepared for this. And that was, you can't explain this with the latest influx. There was a problem that already existed before. Teacher training, teacher development, capacity, support, giving schools the means to provide language instruction. All of those things were lacking already before this latest crisis, in the case of Italy.
Given this latest crisis and the fact that many of the European countries that are receiving large influxes of immigrants are also countries that haven't fully recovered from the economic crisis of a few years ago, what should these countries make the top priority for immigrant students now, since they probably can't develop an entire system right away?
Yeah, I think that is a very legitimate question, and but we also need to be careful not to prioritize the urgent over the important. If we do not address the needs of those students in schools adequately today, we're going to have a much larger problem in the future. Actually, when I showed you that often second language immigrants do worse in school, both academically and socially, than their first generation counterpart, that's a great illustration. That is the price we pay if we do not achieve adequate integration, social and academically, in school. That's why schools need to prioritize this, and that's something where they need to invest in the number of teachers, in the quality of teachers, in the teacher development. It's not going to be dealt with through initial teacher training. That's only going to work through continuing education and training, through the teachers who are already in school. It can also mean drawing in more intelligent ways on immigrant populations themselves. If we're looking for people who can teach that kind of language of the immigrant groups, maybe among the refugees, among the migrants, we're going to find them. Often our kind of employment systems in school systems are far too rigid in order to draw on the talent that we need to address those issues. But if we are creative, if we are sufficiently creative, there's a lot of resources in our society that we should be mobilizing to address the challenge. We simply cannot leave that to the future because, again, the cost of inaction is much larger than the cost of action here.
In a related question, the integration of immigrants does not only rely on education. So what are other examples of policy solutions that are more holistic, i.e. not simply education, but also socioeconomic, social, etc.?
Very good point. Obviously, education is just one part of the puzzle. Housing, social integration, social support, employment for parents, all of those these pieces play. And the OECD, actually, we look at the holistic picture and to study all of those interactions quite carefully. But education is a very, very important part for the next generation. And if you look at the age structure of the immigrant population these days, the refugees in Europe, these are young people, and they're going to come, they either have their children or they're going to bring their children. So this is a formidable challenge for our school systems today, for which education systems need to prepare. It's also a question, what is our view school, what of the services that schools should provide? Should schools remain a place where students acquire just knowledge and skills, or should schools play a greater role in providing social support, integrative support for parents? And again, there are very, very good examples. I would like to cite Canada here, where actually Canada tries to make schools the center of the community, which is actually not just an academic institution, but which has a lot of social responsibilities. I think we need to, again, mobilize all resources of the society. It's a whole of society challenge, and it requires a whole of society, not just a whole of government response.
Another question, are there any data that relate performance of learners with an immigrant background with the educational provision for inclusion and diversity more generally?
It's a good point. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to measure the inclusiveness of education system as such. What we have measured is the degree to which there's social segregation in the system. And what I can say here is that any form of social segregation in the education system, whether it's tracking, whether it's streaming, whether it's special needs education, special needs schools, and so on, any form of tracking and stratification tends to reinforce the impact which both immigration and social disadvantage have on learning outcomes. I know it's only a part of the answer to this question, but it's the only part for which we have comparative data.
Sort of an interesting technical question. How is the socioeconomic status of immigrant students measured? If they were wealthy in their old country, but poor when they arrived in their new country, how would they be classified?
Yeah, we basically measure their current level of socioeconomic background. So we ask the students, for example, what is the number of books they have at home, what is the family wealth, what educational resources they have, what occupation do their parents currently have, and often that occupation may be at a lower level than the occupation the parents had in their country of origin. But we are basically focusing on the current status of the students and their families.
Public opinion about immigrants is getting worse in some countries, one of our participants notes. How can we use the data that you presented today to make a change in this?
Yeah, very important point. I think actually the data that you see here dispel many of the myths and negative images associated with immigration. They dispel the notion that this is overwhelming schools, that schools cannot deal with this. Some school systems are very effective in dealing with this. They dispel the notion that all immigrants are low performers. As you could see, actually, the share of top performers is as high among immigrant students as among non-immigrants. The educational ambitions of those students are often at least as high as of those of students without an immigrant. I think what all of this data together suggests is that these students and their families are far more an asset to the countries than they are a problem. So I think there's a lot that societies can actually gain by effectively integrating those students. They bring with them talent, they bring with them the will actually to achieve the educational ambitions. If we can provide the opportunities for them to actually reach those ambitions, I think our societies are going to be a lot better off.
Do you think any of the data that we've seen here emphasizes a need to reduce class size in a way to provide quote-unquote better support to these students?
Well, that's a question that often comes up. We haven't really studied that specifically in the context of immigrant students, but overall, over time and over countries, one of the things that we've seen is whenever countries have to make a choice between, a better teacher or a smaller class, countries that get the best results typically go for the better teachers. So they invest, in additional support, in out-of-classroom instruction. They invest in teacher preparation, teacher collaboration. They put a lot of resources in the environment that make teachers grow in their professional careers rather than in making classes smaller. To what extent those findings can be extrapolated to immigrant students, I can't say. But one of the things that we have seen, for example, in PISA is that the degree of perceived personalization in learning is also not related to class size. The quality of student-teacher relationships, not even that seems to be related to class size. It's all related to other qualities of the teaching population. So in our efforts to reduce class size, we must not forget those other
Another question, a participant asked about a specific table, a figure that was seen on sheet 24. The participant mentioned that some countries are missing and was wondering if that's for any particular reason. The participant was interested in knowing what the results would have been for the Netherlands, for example.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have those data only for a selection of countries.
Okay. Well, I think that does it. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
This webinar has been recorded and will be available in a few days on our website, www.oec.org/edu. And we want to wish you all happy holidays and a very peaceful new year. Thank you.